a great lesson for us to kind of take away some things. Before we get started, I'm going to lead us just in a quick word of prayer, and then we'll jump into our study. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day, the beginning of a new week, and we're excited to be here to worship you and to lift up your glorious name. Father, we're so thankful for the Bible, that we have it so freely accessible, that we can read it, that we can learn from it, we can understand exactly who you are and who we're supposed to be in light of that. Father, I just pray that you be with us during our study this morning, that we would take away the things that we need to take away from this, that would change us, that it would humble us, and that we would be reminded of the God that we serve. We pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, so Daniel chapter 5. We kicked this off on Wednesday night and really kind of read about the first half of it, and we set up a little bit of context for what's going on in Daniel chapter 5. And if you remember going through that study, we've spent some time in this class covering a little bit of the history of the things that are going on in this part of the world. Obviously, a big part of Daniel is talking about the fact that God is in control, that he's involved in the affairs of men as far as great nations rising up and taking over other great nations. And we see these things kind of play out through history, and Daniel's obviously being revealed some of these things that are going to happen. And so with that context in mind, where we're reading in Daniel chapter 5, we've been going through this study of Daniel chronologically, not just chapter by chapter, but chronologically. So we've kind of leapfrogged and jumped around a little bit. We're back here in chapter 5. The year is 539 BC. We are in the city of Babylon, there in the Babylonian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire, though, they're on the move, and they're ascending, and they're kind of moving around the region and slowly kind of taking over place after place after place. And they have now set their sights on Babylon to come and conquer the city, this great city of Babylon. So we have really these Medo-Persian forces being led by Cyrus the Great. And we're going to talk about Cyrus the Great a little bit towards the end of our time this morning. But he is leading these forces around. He's already very likely captured King Nabonidus, who was actually the main ruling king over the Babylonian Empire at the time. He was not in the city of Babylon, a lot of historians think. So he's already been captured. The Babylonian forces have already, outside the city, have already been taken. And you've got this Medo-Persian Empire, and their forces have now basically encircled the city of Babylon. All that being said, we've talked about what an amazing city Babylon was. A lot of the historians think that this was the biggest and most populated city that the world had ever seen to this point in time. Just a really, feat of not just engineering, but just, a cultural center. And all these people are inside of the city, inside the city walls, and they're feeling pretty good. I mean, it's basically a fortress. We know from history and obviously digs and things. I mean, it was like a fortress. So they've got these fortified walls all around. You've got the Euphrates River that kind of goes around part of the city, and they've got moats and things that are kind of going around the city. And they've got reserves or stocks of food that a lot of historians think they could have lasted at least 10 years in a major siege. So the people are feeling pretty good. Belshazzar is kind of the regent ruling over the city of Babylon at the time. And in his, arrogance and ego and pride, they have this great feast. He throws this great big party and celebration and feast inside the city walls, even though they're basically encircled and ready to be taken out. So we, last class read this account of they're having this great feast. They're drinking and having all kinds of food. He basically calls, hey, go and grab all of these basically vessels that had been taken out of the temple of Jerusalem and bring them in. We're going to use these for all my guests and everything. And then immediately, this hand, the fingers of a human hand appear and start writing this kind of cryptic message on the wall. And Belshazzar, what does he do? He just comes unglued. I mean, it basically, it says his knees are knocking together. He just goes flush white. I mean, he is scared to death like he's seen a ghost. And then what does he do?
The astrologers and the magicians, he wanted to tell what this meant.
He does the protocol of every guy we've seen before from Babylon, go and call all these wise men to come in and tell me what this thing means that we're seeing on the wall. I think it was great. We kind of made the point on Wednesday night. Even though they didn't really understand what it meant, they knew it wasn't good news. I mean, it seems pretty clear. This is not some great thing that's on the wall. This is bad news. So, where we kind of left off last class, chapter 5, verse 10, it says when the queen had heard what was happening, she reminded Belshazzar, hey, there's somebody that knows probably what this means. And who was that? Daniel. So I kind of posed that question for us last time. What does that tell us about Belshazzar? What can we kind of surmise a little bit maybe of Belshazzar? She remembers this thing. He doesn't seem like he really knows who Daniel is. I mean, and if you guys remember, we talked, it's been only roughly about, we think, like 25 years from the time that Nebuchadnezzar II had died, which, is obviously such a prominent figure here in Daniel. And it seems like Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar had a pretty good some kind of relationship. I mean, they were at least somewhat respectable to each other. And here, Belshazzar, when we're going to read this, but it seems like he doesn't really know him, doesn't really have a great sense of respect for him. And so, I read that and I think it's very easy that, this time has gone by and history has just been forgotten, essentially, these things that have happened, and not that long of a time. So I want us to read. We're going to pick back up here in Daniel 5, starting in verse 13, and I'll have that up here on the screen for us. So she suggested, hey, bring this guy Daniel in, and so he calls for Daniel. So verse 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king. And the king answered and said to Daniel, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I've heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Again, kind of, we're maybe reading into it a little bit, but how does he kind of address Daniel when Daniel walks in the room? And mind you, we think Daniel's probably about 80 years old when this goes on. I think a lot of times we read Daniel and we just think Daniel's like 20 perpetually the whole time through the whole story, but he's about 80 years old when this happens. How does he kind of address Daniel and treat Daniel? Yeah, Dan.
I read this, it struck me. Remember a few chapters back, Nebuchadnezzar placed Daniel in charge of all the wise men, the whole country. Now it appears he doesn't know who Daniel is.
Yeah. How does that happen? I guess there's been a couple kings in between here, but yeah. Seems like Daniel's kind of been forgotten and Daniel's kind of off.
It's very reminiscent of Joseph.
I was going to say, does it remind us of anything? What happened when Joseph was called back in? He'd just been kind of forgotten about.
There came a time when the Pharaohs didn't know Joseph.
Yeah. So we see these things happen. What does he offer Daniel here? Bunch of cool stuff, right? Hey, we're going to get you some nice clothes and, jewelry, and you'll get this prominent position. You think this impressed Daniel? I mean, why?
He's never been impressed with the rulers. He's impressed with God only. And he knows that they're not following God. And first of all, he says, we know the spirit of the gods.
Reminiscent of what he's heard before, right? He's kind of heard this whole thing before.
He's been there and done that before.
Yeah. if I'm 80 years old and I've already basically seen all this stuff anyways, and I'm seeing it again, all right. And we're going to see how he responds to Belshazzar, but he's not. This isn't really doing a whole lot for Daniel. He's not all that impressed with what Belshazzar is trying to do for him here.
From the time he was 15 years old and taken into Babylonian captivity, he's known the true God, and he's
Yeah.
followed the true God in spite of all of the threats and the promises and everything. He knows that God's in control.
Yeah.
And Jay, it's a common trait that you see in other men of faith, strong faith with God who have these interactions with Him. It is that true meekness. They have that quality where they are confident, yet they are humble before God. So they know that all of their needs and sufficiency is from above.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll see how he responds here, but Daniel could have been like, "Hey, man, I've already, that's not impressive to me." I mean, he could have come back at him a little differently here. I've already been a big shot, and he doesn't. That's not how Daniel comes back to Belshazzar. How he does is very interesting, though, and I want us to read that. So, if we go to the continuation here of the text, verse 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. And the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. I'll just finish it. And then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed, and this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So, we see the way Daniel responds here. The king offers him all, please tell me what these things mean, and I'll give you all this great stuff, right? And positions of power and whatnot. Could Daniel have just come in and interpreted this thing and just kind of walked out? I mean, he could have just come in and said, hey, this is what it means. Here you go. What does he do?
He really preaches a sermon by going back through history. Because the things that happened to Nebuchadnezzar, they were a lesson, not just for Nebuchadnezzar, but for all men, especially his successors. Belshazzar should have known what that was all about.
Yeah.
It struck me in the next verse that after you got this anointment varnished away, next thing he does is give the order to put purple on it and put a gold in it. So it didn't register.
Didn't seem like it sunk in, really.
He just went ahead and finished paying and fulfilled his promise. It didn't register.
Yeah. I like what Dad said here. He kind of preaches at him, which shouldn't be unusual. I mean, if we think back to just other men of God through the Old Testament, and even getting into the New Testament, I think about Moses, I think about Joshua, and the things that they would get up and basically give a little bit of a history lesson. Hey, these are things that happened. And this is what happened as a result of what we did or what our forefathers did and things like that. What about Peter on the day of Pentecost? He kind of gets up and gives a little bit of a history lesson. Hey, these are things that happened, and this is what's going to happen as a result of that. That's what Stephen did, right? I mean, so we kind of see a pattern here of people have an opportunity to say the truth, and in doing so, they kind of give a little bit of a history lesson here. And these are the things you either should have learned, or you need to go back and look at and make sure you understand, because
You might think of it in terms of presenting evidence.
yeah, because there's definitely a judgment coming. So for sure. Do you see, we talked about how Belshazzar kind of looks at Daniel, but how can we surmise anything of the way we think maybe Daniel thinks about Belshazzar and the way he kind of responds here? He's obviously not disrespectful, but kind of just comes off like it's a little direct of just, hey, you can keep your stuff to yourself, man, but you need to hear some stuff. You need to hear some things, is a little bit how it reads to me. So what does Daniel say is the problem? What's Belshazzar's problem here?
He said he had humbled himself.
Hmm.
He tried to make himself to be something when he really wasn't in God's eyes.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, we say he had not forgotten this or whatever, but Daniel says, you knew all of this.
Yeah.
I don't want to read it any other way with that, but he had apparently forgotten about Daniel, so I don't know.
Yeah. So hadn't humbled him. It says you've not humbled your heart. You knew all these things, and you still didn't humble yourself.
Well, it says you lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven.
What does that mean? How might somebody like Belshazzar be lifting himself up against the Lord of heaven?
Seems to be an arrogance about it. Bring temple objects into the celebration almost like into the face that we're greater than we conquered the Jews and that sort of thing. And there's no respect for God including that position, that sort of thing.
And when he talks here about you've lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven, and the next thing, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and who else? So he's doing wrong, and he's basically bringing everybody else into the things he's doing that are wrong. When we think about somebody being sinful, but then also dragging everybody else into their sin too, that we kind of can see a little bit of that going on here.
While he's doing that, he's praising the gods of these silver and gold
Yeah.
instead of the God of heaven. And he's doing that using the vessels from the temple.
Yeah.
Right.
It seems like, if we go back and look at Nebuchadnezzar, obviously Nebuchadnezzar was kind of given like a bit of an ultimatum that, hey, if you don't change, this is going to happen to you. And then we see sort of what was that last straw with Nebuchadnezzar before he gets humbled? He's kind of walking around at his place and just going, look at how great look at all this amazing stuff I've done. And then it's boom, it seems to be kind of the last straw. Seems like here, obviously we don't know exactly what's been going on with Belshazzar prior to this, but clearly he has had a similar attitude to what Nebuchadnezzar had. But I would appeal that him dragging out the vessels and doing these things, that seems to be kind of the last straw here. It's like this is tacked on specifically in addition to him just being, kind of lifting himself against the Lord and being arrogant and having the pride. It seems like this is kind of the last straw. And the implication we kind of read there too, Daniel's implying here, should Belshazzar have known who the God of heaven is? Seems pretty clear here. I mean, you knew these things. You knew the stuff that happened to Nebuchadnezzar. And I'm sure people, even if all the common people weren't exactly sure what was going on, I'm sure people knew about this guy that went and lived like a wild beast in the field for 7 years and then had his mind kind of restored to him. So I guess a question I've got is, Belshazzar's yes, please.
I was going to say, I think it's almost three separate things. You've lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven, and you brought the vessels out, and you brought other people into it. The whole story of this is what happened to Nebuchadnezzar this is how Nebuchadnezzar lifted himself up against the Lord of heaven, and you are doing more than what he did.
Yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar, we don't have any record, at least that I know of him bringing all the things out that he took from the temple. He just kind of kept them hidden away. But I think this chapter to me has always seemed like Daniel's just tired. He had all of his life. I think at the end he had a good relationship with Nebuchadnezzar. We see him in chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar is using the same Aramaic words to identify God that Daniel is using. So there seems to be some progress. And then now over this up to 25 years, he's just seen all of that progress going away. Yeah. And it's starting all over with Belshazzar.
Yeah, it's like,
And you just can't lose sight of the fact that the Persian forces were right outside the door. And you just wonder if Daniel knows that, that this is going to be the end. Because he's seen Nebuchadnezzar's vision. He's had visions, and yet they're so arrogant. And we don't want to miss this either. He talks about the gold objects and all that, and he's praising them, which you do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand owns all your ways. Here's that comparison. You've witnessed all these great things that happened to Nebuchadnezzar, and you didn't pay any attention to it. And now you're here pulling out all the vessels of the temple and treating it almost like idolatrous emblems. And you don't get who God is.
a question I was thinking about is, was there an expectation for Belshazzar to live a certain way? He's a Gentile man, right? A Gentile king, this rule. But the way Daniel comes to him and says these things, like, is there an expectation that Belshazzar was supposed to be living a certain way? Seems pretty obvious. Like, yeah, I think the answer is yes. Obviously, he's not Jewish. He wouldn't be following the old laws and things like that. But it's even still, there's an expectation that you should be living a certain way, Belshazzar, and recognizing the God of the Most High. And I guess following that train of thought, I mean, what's a takeaway from of that for us today? Even for people that don't know who they don't come to into church. I mean, is right and wrong and the things we're supposed to be doing, is that a universal truth that God's instilled in us? I think absolutely. And obviously things maybe have changed a little bit for us today in some ways with with Christ coming and fulfilling his purpose and stuff. But I think we can look at Belshazzar, and he knew what he was supposed to be doing, and he was just ignoring it. He was ignoring the things that he should have been doing.
God gave Nebuchadnezzar a second chance. He humbled him by making him almost like an animal. Belshazzar, he didn't do that.
Yeah.
It was like, you went way too far.
Yeah.
You pulled out the gold from the temple, and now you're
He kind of went like right to strike three, like pretty fast. It seems kind of like.
Jay,
Yeah.
just a couple of thoughts. There's a common phrase that we use today, and it comes from Solomon's proverb. Specifically, it says, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." And you see that played out here. Now, you go back to Nebuchadnezzar, and there wasn't anything previous to the lion's den and the fiery furnace that he had to see before he realized that God was almighty. And then it was the last straw that sent him into being a wild beast for 7 years, and he fully came to understand that. Now that's on record now for Belshazzar.
Yeah.
And he understands that fully. So what we have to remember in our daily lives, not that we're big rulers or anything, but we still have to remember that elsewhere in Proverbs there is, before destruction a man's heart is haughty, but humility comes before honor. And that's how we have to remember to live our lives every single day with a humble heart.
Yeah.
It's always
So I want to spend some time, just a few minutes here, actually talking about this thing that's been written on the wall, right? So we read this phrase, mene, tekel, parsin, and kind of what does that mean? Obviously, we see an interpretation of that from Daniel. But when you kind of read the text, I was talking with Dad about this last night after we ate dinner. You read this, and it says that they couldn't read it, and they certainly couldn't interpret it. But what we know from this is, these were words in Aramaic. So I don't know if that means, I'm not exactly sure what's going on here. Like, were they just actually not able to read this stuff, or could they just not make sense of what it was saying? Either way, they're not sure what's going on, but Daniel's able to come interpret this for them. But what's interesting, if you guys go and do any kind of your own research on this, which I would always encourage you to do that stuff, all three of these words that are used really are measures of weight and money, right? So this is kind of like, I think in the notes, some notes I've been reading, it's kind of like, this would be like saying like dollar, quarter, nickel, or something like that, right? It kind of reads like that. And so maybe that is where they're reading this, but they're like, I'm not sure what this is actually trying to say. Now, the thing that's a little interesting or confusing to me about that too is those words are also kind of tied to verbs. And so when you read that, and certainly when you read Daniel's interpretation here, it makes sense, right? So mene is kind of tied in with a mina, and that's 60 shekels, I think, is what I was able to pick out. But it also comes from a verb that means to number. So that kind of tracks here. Tekel was tied to a single shekel, but also comes from the verb to weigh. And then that parsin or upharsin, if you read, depending on which translation you're reading, that was like a half shekel, but it was also from the verb to divide. And that was the kind of the plural of the word paris or paris. And so when you read that, where Daniel interprets it, and he says paris, and you wonder, well, okay, why does it say paris versus a parsin or parsin? It's just basically kind of, I don't know, I guess kind of play off of words here of things that just have similar meanings going on. But what does Daniel say? What is the interpretation here? I mean, he delivers the interpretation. What does he say that this means? Obviously revealing this from God's hand. You're done. Yeah. Yeah, your days are numbered. The days of your kingdom you're done. Okay. You've been weighed. You've been weighed in the balances and found wanting, and your kingdom is going to be divided. And specifically, it's going to be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Hey, these guys that are outside your walls, it's over. It's happening right now. And I just encourage us to think about this, right? Daniel's 80 years old. We said he's kind of seen it and done it. Does Daniel seem to have any kind of like fear, hesitation of saying this stuff? I mean, the message. What's he saying here to Belshazzar? I mean, it's over, man. You're the ruler here in Babylon, and do you think the ruler of Babylon is going to want to hear that? Probably not. And maybe he does. We're using the phrase "handwriting on the wall." The writing's on the wall. I mean, maybe he already is coming to realize that, but he's hearing this now.
It doesn't say repent, your kingdom will be saved. It just says it's
Yeah,
literally it's just over.
it's over. So we'll continue in our text here. Verse 29, then Belshazzar gave the command, as Daryl said, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So there's a few things going on here. I think it's important to pull in some of this historical context again for us, just to understand kind of the things that are happening here. I'm continually astounded at just how much information exists from people that lived around this time and even shortly thereafter. We can go and read, historical things from people that, historians that were living at the time writing about some of these things. There was a guy named Herodotus. He was a Greek historian and geographer, but he lived like through this time. He lived from 484 down to 425 BC, so this is happening 539 BC, right? He lived shortly thereafter, rather. But he's, not that far removed from stuff, writing about these things that happened. And he writes that Cyrus, with the first approach of the ensuing spring, marched forward against Babylon. The Babylonians encamped without their walls, awaited his coming. The battle was fought at a short distance from the city, in which the Babylonians were defeated by the Persian king. So again, this is the stuff that's going on around the city, whereupon they withdrew into their defenses. So the rest of the guys that weren't defeated came into the city walls. Here they shut themselves up and made light of his siege, having laid in store a provision for many years in preparation against this attack. For when they saw Cyrus conquering nation after nation, they were convinced that he would never stop and that their turn would come at last. There's another gentleman, his name was Xenophon. He was a Greek military strategist and also a historian, lived at a similar time as Herodotus that we just read about. And he records some of the events of the festival that were apparently going on. They were having a night, so this was kind of going on at nighttime, a night festival, drinking, revelry, all kind of that stuff, which we can kind of picture our heads from what we see in the text. It says, Cyrus turned aside the course of the river, right? So we're talking about the Euphrates River. This is how they got in. He had a corps of engineers. They essentially divert the Euphrates River away from the city walls, and that's how their guys got in and came up at nighttime and got up into the city. And we read that they basically got in, killed the king, and there was no real battle or anything, which kind of tracks again with what we see in the text. It's really incredible, and we've already referenced this stuff a couple times. But the Nabonidus Chronicles, which were again, Nabonidus was Belshazzar's father. That's where we actually can go and read that Belshazzar was real, he existed. But we also see the Cyrus cylinder. So from kind of the other side of the coin on the Medo-Persian side, reading these things from Cyrus, they describe the battles and fall of the city. It happened in the month of Tishri, which was the month of October. Cyrus fought and destroyed the people of Akkad on basically the Tigris River, so where the Tigris and Euphrates kind of run together. Talks about in that month them going and chasing down Nabonidus, capturing him. And then on the 16th day of that month, it says Gobryas, the governor, and troops of Cyrus entered Babylon without fighting. And we're going to talk more about Gobryas here in a second, but we can go and read these things from historical artifacts that have been recovered and read about some of these very things that happened, which I think is helpful to kind of fill in the gaps of what's going on in this story. Now, I think it's also important to point out Daniel, if you go and do any kind of reading and research on Daniel, there's a lot of stuff online where people basically say, historians obviously don't look at Daniel as a credible account. It's a fictional reading of these people that didn't really live and things like that. And we're not reading Daniel from the standpoint of a historian per se, but I do think it's really amazing that we obviously believe Daniel's real and that it happened, but we can go and read Daniel and see the things that happen in Daniel, and they do obviously line up with what we read about just from secular history. So I think it's important to kind of make that distinction. So the fortress of Babylon, right? We think about this. It's nighttime in Babylon. People are probably mostly sleeping probably by this time, except for this big party that's going on. And you've got Cyrus's forces that have encircled. They've diverted the river, and they're starting to creep in and come up into the city, and they're going to take the city. And it's just amazing, right? I think the last slide I've got, if we've got time for it, Isaiah talked about this stuff. 150 years before it happened, Isaiah is prophesying that these things are going to happen, that Babylon's going to rise up, Cyrus is going to be their ruler, or that Cyrus is going to be ruling over the Persian Empire, and that Babylon's going to fall. It's just really incredible. You just kind of envision, we talked about these walls are 100 feet tall and 30 feet thick, and just what that would have looked like, and them coming in and taking it without even having to have a battle over it. I mean, if that's not God's hand, what are we talking about?
It's kind of funny because I look at where Belshazzar, rewards Daniel. In my mind, it's like he does these things and gives Daniel the gold chain and all this, and then immediately the forces come in. That's in my mind.
Yeah.
It seems like they no sooner go through this with Daniel than the Persian forces are in the city.
It happens pretty rapidly, it seems.
Daniel
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we don't know, but obviously he hangs around and he's involved with what's going on after, just from what we're going to see in the rest of the story of Daniel. But I think it's worth pointing out here too. When you start digging into this, we read there at the text, at the very end of the text, verse 31, it says, "And Darius the Mede took the kingdom," inherited the kingdom, or however it reads. Who is Darius the Mede? Because when you start digging into this, Darius the Mede is not Cyrus the Persian. Like, these are clearly two different people I think we're talking about here. If you go, and again, we just referenced Isaiah. Isaiah he attributes Cyrus to be the one that's going to conquer Babylon. You can go read over in Isaiah 44 and 45. But here we see Darius the Mede. And so there's been a lot of debate over the years, Bible scholars and people trying to figure out, all right, who is this really talking about? Some people think it is just another name for Cyrus, but that doesn't really seem likely. That doesn't seem like how that would probably how he would have been referred to. But interestingly, that name Darius or Darius, we kind of read that as like it's just a name, but actually that's kind of given as a title, a bit of a title. So when we kind of think about somebody being called Lord, a Lord or something like that, that's kind of what we see this name for. And so rather than a proper name, this may just be really kind of talking about somebody. This kind of may be a little bit of an alias here, a little bit of a generic alias of this Mede that comes in, and he's going to be kind of the regent or governor over this city, which tracks with some of the other things we see. If you go read from that Nabonidus Chronicle thing we talked about, this man Gobryas is mentioned. I think I referenced his name a second ago. This was one of Cyrus's generals, and he was a Mede. And he was actually, we read from some of those texts that, not the biblical text, but external texts, that he was basically the leader, the military leader that got them into the city. So he would have been kind of the general that led them into the city. And so it's very likely that this Gobryas guy is kind of who really Darius the Mede was. It's interesting as well because when you get further into the Daniel story, Darius is still around as part of this Daniel story later on with the lion's den and things like that. But Daniel 6, when we get to that story, it talks about the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus. So these two guys are both in positions of power, and I think that also kind of lends to the point that these are not the same person. And it would make sense almost kind of like how Belshazzar was basically the king of the city of Babylon, even though his dad was actually the king of the empire. That's kind of, I think, what we're seeing here. It seems like Cyrus is clearly the ruler, Cyrus the Great. He's the ruler of the Medo-Persian Empire, but this Gobryas guy, if this is kind of his right-hand man from the Mede side, he's being kind of put in position over the city of Babylon. Just a kind of a final point here, as we think about these things. We've been talking about the age of the Gentiles, and I know, again, it's not everybody's thing is history and dates and places and names and all that kind of stuff, but if we're seeing any big takeaway from this story, it's that God is in control, and He is involved in the affairs of men, and as these nations and empires rise and fall and move, God is very intricately working these things. I mean, He is working His plan. We talked about Isaiah, 150 years before these things happen, he's talking about mentioning Cyrus by name, and then Cyrus goes and does these things. Just absolutely remarkable. I'll just read that text for us, right? So that's from the book of Isaiah. It says, "Thus says the Lord to His anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him that gates may not be closed. I will go before you and level the exalted places. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hoards in secret places, that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who call you by your name." We're going to see more, obviously, of this Medo-Persian Empire as we continue to read through the story, but, just when we think about, this nation could never fall, or the United States could never fall, I mean, in the blink of an eye, God snaps His fingers, and this king is taken out, and an entire new reign and regime and empire has now just taken over the Babylonian Empire that, again, we talked about how long was their reign, as an empire, and how great they were. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of a flash in the pan, right? So just really amazing for us to think about. So we're going to be...
Well, this is bringing in the empire that
Yeah.
will let the Jewish captives go home.
Yeah, so the 70 years of captivity, we're getting towards the end of that, right? And when we go and read from Ezra and Nehemiah and those stories and those accounts, right? We are just kind of coming into that time where that stuff's going to start happening very soon. I forgot I had that picture up there. That's actually the tomb of Cyrus the Great over in Iran that still exists today. So again, it should build our faith that these were real people. They really lived. They really interacted with real people like Daniel, and these stories are not just stories. They're there for us to learn and be changed by them and be humbled. Humble ourselves so God doesn't humble us. So we're going to be in Daniel chapter 9. Again, I said we're kind of leapfrogging around. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 9 on Wednesday night, and this is Daniel's great prayer. He has this really amazing, great prayer that we're going to spend time going through and reading and dissecting a little bit. So read chapter 9, and that's where we'll pick up next class. Thank you.